Welcome to Take the Lead Radio with Dr. Diane Hamilton, where she interviews some of the most successful leaders, entrepreneurs, authors, speakers, and other individuals who will inspire you to take the lead in your career and personal life. And now, here is Dr. Diane Hamilton.
Welcome to Take the Lead Radio. I'm Dr. Diane Hamilton, and I'm so glad you joined us today because my guest is Lesley Hamilton, who is a travel nurse recruiter, account manager, and director. She has enjoyed enormous success at both small and industry giants such as Supplemental Health, Robert Half, and AMN. It's so nice to have you here, Lesley. Welcome.
Thank you, Diane. I'm happy to be here.
Well, this is fun. I'm looking forward to doing this. And I think we should probably mention right off the bat, since anybody watching this might notice we look a little bit alike. Lesley is my sister. And so I know a lot about your background because I've lived it, but people listening may not know it. So why don't you give us your backstory so we can find out how you reached this level of success?
Yes, I'd be happy to. In the professional sense, I've been a recruiter for about 30 years, been around the block a little bit, and most of that staffing experience has been in the RN travel recruiting arena, which is a highly competitive and lucrative industry and has been for some time. I've been, as you've mentioned, Diane, I've been in the recruiter role, account management role, director role. I've started agencies from scratch. I've trained, mentored, and have enjoyed just about every position there is regarding travel nurse recruiting.
Well, I know you work really hard because I've seen you. But I think a lot of people don't know a lot about nurse travel and staffing industry information. And it's kind of different than some of the other industries. And I think a lot of people could learn from just what is it and how is it different from those other industries?
Travel nurse recruiting is generally 13-week contracts for nurses across the country. And I've only worked in the United States, not internationally. So what I do is I place nurses in 13-week contracts at different hospitals in different states around the country, depending on the needs of the hospitals. And this is highly desirable for nurses who are able to travel. They are paid very well, and it's become absolutely a booming industry for all types of demographics.
Well, as you said that, I'm looking up I had a guy on my show who was part of Thinkers 50 who was in the nursing industry, and he shared a story. It was really fascinating about how they do nursing in some of the European countries. That they don't even have bosses. They decide how to work together, and they join these groups of nobody being the boss. And it's a really fascinating story. So I'll link that in the show notes. So people, if you're interested,
that would be fun.
Great show. But I want to talk about your industry just because this is something that comes up a lot when I interview for on gmn.net. I interview a lot of CHROs that they're all these companies are all worried about how COVID's impacted their business and what the current trends are and all that. And I know it's probably similar for a lot of industries that there are a lot of issues out there. So I'm curious what issues or trends you've had to deal with since COVID.
A lot of we're experiencing right now is a post-COVID hangover in the travel nursing field. During COVID, there's a huge demand for travelers. Travelers are requested when there are more patients, or they call it a higher census. And during COVID, the demand was sky high. And so the travel nursing business thrived. And there was such a demand for the COVID nurses, and therefore the rates for the nurses went way up. The hospitals pay the rates, and the agencies pay the nurses. And what they typically have made in the past, anywhere from, let's say, 2,500 to 5,000 a week. They're during COVID making anywhere from 5 to 10,000 a week. And so that was during the COVID heyday for the travelers. It's not a positive connotation for COVID, but the nurses did make quite a bit of money in the travel side. A lot of permanent nurses left their staff, their regular permanent staff jobs, to become travelers. And now the demand for nurses has gone way down. The rates have gone way down, but the travel industry still survives, and it has survived. I was working during the 2008 downsizing, and still travel nursing is very strong business in that hospitals need nurses to fill in when perm nurses are either, let's say, on maternity, or they take vacations, or the patient count or census is not up. It's a lucrative choice for the hospitals to fill in their needs with the travelers, rather than spend the money on the permanent nurses when they only need them perhaps for vacations, leaves, or perhaps seasonal needs. So to answer your question, right now, the trends for travel is still very high, not as high, anywhere near as high as it was during COVID, but about the same as it was pre-COVID. And it's hard for the nurses to get used to those pre-COVID rates.
Yeah,
and yes.
I would imagine, as I'm thinking about who would be a travel nurse, meet the Fockers or Meet the Parents, and that comes to mind when he was a male nurse. So I'm curious, what are the demographics of your nurses? Do you get a lot of men, or are they mostly women? I would just
there are a lot of male nurse travelers, and percentage wise that I have worked with, I would say probably 80% women, 20% men. I love working with the male nurses. I think that's about the right percentage in any of the agencies that I've worked in, large and small. Age groups really differ. Let's see, well, there's a range. It could be a younger nurse in their 30s or possibly even late 20s, up until I have a nurse working right now that's 75 years old, and she's working med surg, which is one of the toughest units, and she's got 7 patients to 1, and she's still traveling. So there's a wide range, and with travel nursing, the demand that all the hospitals ask for the travel nurse is that they have at least 1, typically 2 years experience already in the hospital. So therefore it excludes new graduates, nurses that have not had a year or 2 in the hospital under their belt. They're not considered as good resources for travel nursing. The hospitals are our clients. They pay the bills, and they pay a premium rate hourly for nurses, and they pay that rate for a nurse that can what they say is hit the ground running. They don't want someone to train. They want someone that can adapt, that can fit in, that's flexible. And not all nurses do fit into that, but there are so many nurses that have become professional nurses that just go from one 13-week contract to another. They may jump across the country, or they may just keep extending on those 13-week contracts. Another lure for the nurse is that they get paid taxable and non-taxable monies. So if they're a true traveler, they will receive meals and incidentals non-taxed, and housing non-taxed, and travel non-taxed. So that's where one of the biggest lures is the money, because they're netting more with that non-taxed money averaged in. But they also, I would say, the second biggest lure for the nurse would be that they don't have to deal with the politics of the hospital. They're at 13 weeks, and I hear that more than anything. Once a nurse makes the leap, sometimes they're very tentative about leaving a staff job and the stability of getting a travel job after travel job and stringing them together. But once they have taken a travel position, not once in my 30 years, not once have I heard a nurse say, I wish I hadn't left my firm job. They
Hmm.
may have travel assignments they don't like. They may have recruiters or agencies they don't like, but not once have they said, I wish I hadn't gone into traveling. They typically can go back into perm, and they do sometimes. So sometimes they'll go into perm, travel, perm, but not once has there been remorse. And then, moreover, they get the travel bug and don't want to go back to
Yeah.
perm.
I imagine you. I was thinking I ran into a travel nurse not that long ago at a small town here in Arizona, and he loved it. He was telling me he does it all the time. And I just recently watched a New Amsterdam television show. And they had a travel nurse on it, and
Right.
I'm like, wow, this is just like everywhere. But
They are everywhere. If you go to the hospital to visit a friend or relative, most of them are travel nurses. They're
yeah.
everywhere.
Well, I would imagine it would help with burnout. You get tired of doing the same old thing, and it just kind of shakes things up. You mentioned a lot of the pros. I don't know if there's other pros you want to mention, but are there cons that come up at all?
Well, you're traveling away from home. You are thrown into different realities of different cultures, different cliques, different equipment. Not everybody can do that. Not everybody. Some of the nurses feel like they can, and then once they get there, they get homesick. Some of the younger nurses or newer nurses, they don't they don't realize that it what it takes, and they have to be adaptable. There are new protocols, new demands that they're not used to. But the flip side of that are a lot of the younger nurses desire that so that they build their resume. They get more experience with the new and different charting systems, protocols, etc. The travel nurse is working very hard typically away from home and staying, in housing that's not their home, and they're typically working very long hours. And not that they don't do that in the perm arena, but in the travel arena, a lot of times they'll pick up extra shifts. They usually work 3 12-hour shifts or 36 hours, but a lot of them will work 48 hours and may have originally taken the travel assignment for adventure, let's say Hawaii or some,
Yeah.
exotic Virgin Islands, and then learn that it's a lot of work and they're tired. On their days off, they want to sleep. And
Yeah.
so that's some of the cons. And sometimes the travelers feel like they're the fall guy if there are any um, issues that arise in hospitals. The perm nurses may not want to take responsibilities. I should say that that happens a lot, but I've heard nurses complain about that kind of a situation.
As you said that, when I interview CHROs, they talk about the flattening of organizations and how it's changed promotions. And right now, it used to be, I guess, that we would have the ladder. You could be promoted, you go to the next level, you go to the next level, you go to the next level. But now that they're flatter organizations, there's not all these promotions that people can get. So we're seeing that people are being promoted more in terms of experience. It's more of a snake-like movement throughout the company that you're learning over here, and that's how you're building your resume. And that's what you just described for nurses. So you guys are ahead of the game for what other industries were doing because the nurses now, instead of having titles so much, you're getting experience as your title, and that's kind of what's happening in corporate America. So I found that kind of interesting. Are there oh, go
I
ahead.
just want to say that's a great point because it is part of the attraction for the nurses in gaining experience and therefore leveraging their resume in a very quick, short amount of time. They can increase their income by a 13-week assignment that maybe, let's say they're hired for ICU, but let them float to another unit. They won't do it without training, but it is a way for them to climb to a higher income in a short period of time, much shorter than being in a permanent position.
Yeah, I can see that. And I think that in any industry, there's challenges with getting people the experience and getting them prepared for the next assignment or whatever they're going to do. And I think that in this industry, there's probably some misconceptions about how it works or what to expect, or just in general, every industry is that way. Are there any misconceptions that you hear come up a lot? I imagine that's a yes.
The industry is absolutely filled with misconceptions, and it's complicated. It's complicated for owners and recruiters who know the business well, that have been in it for a long time. The rules change, state rules change, compliance rules change. The misconceptions of the nurse, a lot of times the nurse will be very confused, especially a new traveler. She will be deluged if her name is, let's say her resume is on some sort of free site, and she gets deluged probably 20, 30 calls a day. And each recruiter will represent a job order in a different fashion. And they have a different way of paying. They have a different way of setting up the tax and the non-tax monies. And it becomes very confusing to the nurses, and they just get so confused. A lot of times they just don't even want to go forward because there's just too much information. But the nurse, what I would say to them is to pick possibly 3 recruiters that have experience, that you feel that you can trust. Don't get overloaded. A lot of nurses will start talking to 10, 20 people and then forget who they're talking to. Narrow it down to recruiters and companies that have good marks on the social media sites, and find recruiters that you can trust and have them explain it very, very carefully to you, so you understand, so the nurse understands the package, again, because they're so varied in their presentation. And another misconception, or I'll just say a misconception that a nurse has, is that the recruiter is making a whole lot of money off of them.
And sales, yeah, they always
and I'm not saying that being a recruiter for many years, even 2 or 3 years, you can make a lot of money, but you have to have a lot of nurses on assignment. And I hear a lot of times that nurses, once they hear what the bill rate is, that's what the hospital pays, and then they hear what their pay rate is, what the agency has to pay them, they feel that the recruiter is making a lot more money than what they really are making when you factor in all the business burdens and hidden costs. Yes. So, it's a business just like anything else. So I would say that's probably one of the biggest. However, it is a very good and lucrative career for recruiters who have been in it for a long time.
It sounds similar to when I was in the mortgage industry. I mean, you hear numbers and you think all this, but the salespeople don't get what the first number is, and you realize it does take a lot of volume in that industry. You have a lot of phones to actually make a living. And as you were saying that, I was listening to the news this morning. We were talking about the gig economy and how everybody's like 1099s, get all these different jobs and all. It gets, for me, I work for so many universities, they'll send me 1099s or W-2s. I get so many different things. So does it get confusing for nurses when it comes tax time that they have all these different forms of who they've worked for? Or is it, I guess with me, I just combine them all together and
it's very confusing. The tax portion of it is very confusing, and how many miles they have to be from the facility. Is they hear different variations of that rule. To qualify as a travel nurse, there's an industry standard that says 50 miles away that your permanent residence has to be. But when it boils down to it, if you talk to travel nurse tax specialists, and that's what you really need to talk to as a nurse. Their bottom line is you qualify as a traveler if you are paying, and you can show you're paying a duplicate uh, 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 duplicate monies for your houses, so that you're paying.
Yeah, it's like a second home.
Right.
Your second home has to be a certain distance away. It's interesting.
Right.
Very similar to
Right.
that.
And in addition to that, after a year, the government, IRS, says that the nurse has to leave that assignment for whatever tax reasons. That's just the rule, that they have to leave, and there's a certain amount of time that they have to be away, and I don't have that because it changes, and I always say refer to your tax attorney, but as recruiters, we tell them after a year they have to leave the facility. They can go back after a certain number of months, they can go back, but they have to leave for tax reasons. The tax issues are many, and I try to stay away from giving advice, and try to steer the nurses to talk to tax specialists who know travel nursing, because there are so many different rules.
You got to think that these tax specialists now, because of everybody's gig economy, are really up on so much of this stuff. So I bet it's not hard to find that. But
now it didn't used to be.
Now,
like 30 years ago, they didn't know what they were telling them all kinds of things.
I imagine. Yes. But now it's getting better, I'm sure. Yes. And we focused a lot on the nurse. I want to change the focus a little bit to your part of your job and how challenging it is for you to do what you do. What is it? How is it? I mean, is this a tough job?
It is. I used to teach high school English and that was a tough job, but a terrific springboard for punishment. And I wouldn't say it's just totally punishing, or I wouldn't have stayed in it this long. And then it's absolutely has its rewards, but it is it's full time. It is not an 8 to 5. My nurses, the hospitals are 24 hours. I place nurses that have issues, and they may have the night shift, the 7P to 7A. They have issues in the middle of the night. They have my cell phone. They have questions on the weekends before they start on Monday. They need first aid instructions. They feel slighted by maybe cultural cliques that aren't treating them well. Finding nurses is a very competitive process. There are hundreds of agencies and thousands of recruiters competing for the same nurses and competing with the same job orders. It is cutthroat, competitive, frenzied, crazy work.
I've seen you work, so I know. I've seen how busy you can be. And I'm thinking about this, as you mentioned earlier, about nurses getting overwhelmed by people coming after them and all that. Do they tend to avoid putting their profile on LinkedIn, or do they have any kind of like comments in their LinkedIn saying, don't bother me with this or that? Or I'm just wondering if they have any kind of special thing that they avoid there.
Well, the nurses that I deal with typically are not within the last probably five or so years. I've been dealing with more of the ICU, ER, what they call rubber glove type of nurses, and they don't use LinkedIn as much as let's say directors, managers, and leaders. That's more of a link, but it's becoming more and more. It is. But they use sites like Indeed and Vivian and a slew of others. And to your questions, yes, once they post on any site, they are absolutely bombarded. And I will call them, and typically the nurses don't answer, of course. So you try to text and email and try to get in, and it's an art, and persistence is key. And typically they're not going to answer unless they see a valid job order and what the money pays. And even then, they may have been called for that same position 10 other times. And before you even have a chance to call them. So that's why I'll get up at 2 in the morning and call nurse.
Somebody taking your call at 2 in the morning.
Well, I won't call them unless I wouldn't call them to wake them up. I would call them if I saw that they answered my job ad, because they may be at work and they may be getting off of work. And if they're on and they have sent me a message, yes.
Well, and that's commitment. I gotta say.
Yes, it is.
Well, you're talking about working at how different agencies call these nurses and they, get bombarded, but are the agencies any different? Do they differ? I know you've worked for a couple different ones, and I mentioned a few of them at the beginning. How do they differ if they do?
Well, that's such a great question. I'm not prepared for. They do differ. They're different business models. The main difference in agencies, you'll see the smaller to medium or startup companies work typically more in a full desk type of what they call a full desk business model. That's where the recruiter who talks directly to the nurse also submits them to the client, which is usually a vendor, a middleman. And so they work with the nurse and they work with the client. So that's what they call a full desk. The big giants like the AMN, American Mobile, they typically, because they're so gigantic, their business model is more of, they have recruiters who talk just to the nurses, and then they have a separate division of account managers who deal directly with a lot of the times the hospitals directly or the vendors directly. And so there is a big difference in business models in agencies. And sometimes there's a kind of a hybrid mix of those two models. A lot of it does seem the same with a lot of the agencies that I've worked with. You just have it's the personalities of your immediate supervisors become very important, just like any other job. You want to respect and like, and if you're working your life for them, you want to have someone that that you totally again respect and are devoted to not only making money for yourself, but improving the brand name of the company. But with that being said, I've changed agencies a few times, and the grass isn't greener always.
Yeah.
And why would I change? Well, I think it's the age old. Once you feel, I think you're really appreciated when you first start in a company or an agency, and when you feel that you're not, and I think that goes for the nurses as well. That's one of the main reasons why nurses or recruiters, they'll change companies and then starts all over.
Yeah. Well, people don't leave companies, they leave bosses, right?
Yeah. So, I hope my last owner doesn't watch this, because he's terrific and I love him. I really do.
And I know you always had good experiences, and I know you've been very good at doing all the things that some people find really challenging in jobs. And you're not quite as big a nerd on this stuff as I am, but I'm a paperwork freak. I love to do paperwork, and everybody used to make fun of me for that. But there's a ton of paperwork in what you do, isn't there? Isn't this a big, long process to get a travel assignment, or is it not that long of a process? It's just more paperwork?
Oh my God.
There's a lot of paperwork. I know.
To really get the nurse submitted in a very professional, tight, with a tight profile, and which includes, references and skills checklists, and their resume updated, sometimes applications, information transferred over to there, to gather the paperwork from the nurses who are working and so busy and don't want to they just hate to fill out another application, just hate it. That's one of their pet peeves that you hear over and over again.
Yeah.
Just to submit them and then get the ball rolling. And if they get the offer, then to get them compliant is sometimes an act of Congress. And to, not to mention, not just the medical docs and all the employment verifications, they're just, the background tests, the drug tests, there are modules that different hospitals require, and sometimes there are technical issues and their time restraints, and to have them get from accepting the job to starting the job to finishing the job is it is quite a challenge, and everyone's working very hard, not just the recruiter. They need a really good team. They need just a top-notch compliance officer, of which I've had. They need payroll that's terrific, which I've had. And the payroll, inevitably, in every single agency I've worked in, from the mom and pop to the AMNs to the supplementals, inevitably there are going to be mistakes. It's the difference in a good agency, in my opinion, and in nurses' opinion, is how quickly they rectify it, how quickly they pay their nurses. The two things you don't do with nurses are you do not mess with their money, and you do not give them any surprises. They don't want to find out after they're on the assignment, oh, by the way, you have to float over to med surge, or you have to your shifts aren't clustered like you had asked or blocked. Any kind of surprises. And of course, those come up, and it's a killer for a recruiter, and the nurses hate it. And sometimes the nurses think the recruiters aren't, honest with them, and sometimes they're not. I've run across recruiters that are sketchy, will tell them anything.
Yeah.
So it's tough business. Like yes. And it gives and the recruiting business has a very almost salesman or car salesman-y type of reputation, because there's such a turnover with recruiters. Agencies are just absolutely dying for recruiters. They'll hire 5 or 10 at a time and hope the 2 stick, and then those recruiters have to have, let's say, 5 submissions, they'll say unique or different submissions a week. And if they don't meet that criteria, they're fired. So that, that lends itself for them to submit nurses that aren't exactly great fits for the position to keep their job. And it goes on.
Yeah, that's bad. Well, you mentioned the length of time that it takes to get from paperwork to the end of the assignment, but how long is that assignment? And can the nurse decide he or she wants to leave in the middle, and what happens if that happens?
Well, the time process is I receive a job from one of the contracted hospitals that my agency has contracted with. They will submit a job need. Let's say ICU at Hospital X. I get that job need, and I work as in a frenzy to fill it before the thousands of other recruiters that may have that job. And once I find someone that's interested, typically they will interview within about maybe 1 to 2 days, sometimes a week, after I've submitted the nurse. And of course, I've had to get the profile from the nurse, and I have to scramble to do that if I don't already have it. And so once she's submitted, they will interview them. Usually it's a 10-minute phone call interview. It's not like a perm interview. Or now during COVID especially, they'll give the offer off the profile and not even talk to the nurse, which some nurses don't like. And the recruiters love, by the way. And then the nurse, after that offer is given and is accepted by the nurse, they typically start within 2 weeks. And then once they start, after the 2 weeks, they're hustling during that 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. Sometimes you can start them in 3 or 4 days on quick starts, but I'm not even going to go into that. But let's just say 2 weeks for the average. And then once they start, then there's a 13-week contract. So that's the timeline. And then typically after that 13-week contract, more times than not, more than 60%, sometimes more than 70% of the time, they'll extend the nurse or ask them to extend. And if everybody's happy, that's everybody's joy, because then you don't have to go through that whole compliancy process again.
But can they just all of a sudden say, I don't want to do this and walk out?
Well, they don't say it like that. They'll say they have a death in the family. Not to say that they don't get those, because
Yeah.
nurses are the first to get all the tragic
Yeah,
issues.
I'm sure.
And I have to just hand it to them firstly for what they're going through, and then they are dependent upon for with plant family members and etc. But yes, they will leave a contract if there's a health issue, if there is a family death, if there is if they feel their license is in jeopardy, if the hospital if they are asked to do things that they feel is that will jeopardize their license, yes, they do leave, and some agencies will fine them. I don't, I've never been in an agency that's been successful in doing that. And I have never fined a nurse for leaving. But on the flip side of that, the rub with travel nursing is they can cancel their contract as well on the other side.
Does that happen often?
Often enough.
Really?
Well, I mean, one a year is often enough, because I've sometimes worked with a nurse who's traveled from Florida to California on her first assignment. And that happened to me years ago. It doesn't happen a lot, but it's just things that I remember. And they canceled it when she was somewhere in Nebraska or something, and it was just horrible.
Well, it's the same thing in the lending industry. If somebody decides to back out of their loan, or they pay it off like in a couple of days, and then it's all over. You've lost the deal, and that's very frustrating. But
can I just say on that, if that happens, then I would do, and any really good recruiter, and I consider myself one, I should be after so many years, will do everything they can to what they call redirect and get them somewhere, because they've already gone through all of that and they've left their job. It's something that where I just don't sleep till I get them.
Right. I can relate to that. We have that in common. And we talked a little about their pay at the beginning, but is it different from a permanent position? I mean, how's it different?
It is, because there are non-taxed monies, and it's very complicated. But you'll hear different pays. The nurse will say, I'll say, how much money are you making? She's a perm nurse. She'll say $50 an hour. And I'll say, well, I've got a travel job for you. It's $50 an hour, but 30 of that is non-taxed.
Yeah.
So it makes a big difference.
Why is it non-taxed?
Oh, because if they're over 50 miles or pay duplicate, and then they're entitled to the non-tax.
Nice.
Yeah. That's the lure. That's the fetching piece of it. But also you have to factor in, if they're traveling, they're spending money. So if they're traveling to California, then the travel money that they're given is meant to pay for the housing.
Oh, so you can't write that off?
Well, I'm not a tax. I don't know how much, what they can and can't write off, but they will be spending that non-taxed monies either on housing, travel, meals, incidentals. But so many nurses are very savvy. The professional travel nurses, a lot of times they will buddy up, travel together. So they split the housing costs, or work with 3 or 4 others and then divide the housing costs, and then they get all those monies. Or they work at family, friends, locations, and are receiving those monies. But a lot of times they do get a lot of non-tax monies, and it's all governed by a site called the GSA site, an IRS site that will that lists the capped amount they're allowed to receive per day per area zip code, and that's how we ascertain how much to pay them. We give them as much non-taxed money as we can, and then lower the non-taxed so that they net more.
Right. Well, as if a nurse was listening to this and he's trying to find a recruiter or an agency, what would you tell them, him or her, as to how do you pick one? I mean, if you guys are all have 10 of you have the same job you're offering, how do you know which one to go with?
Well, I would look on the sites and find the job that I would be interested in as a nurse,
Mhm.
and give that agency, or apply to that job from that agency. And I think you get a real good feel within the first minute of a recruiter that you can bond with. You can tell if they are, maybe they can't. So that's why I would say call 3 or 4 or 5. If you don't even have to call them, if you have your resume um, posted on Indeed, you're going to be getting calls. And I have asked sometimes when I get a hold of a new nurse, I'll say, "How many calls have you gotten today?" And she said, "Well, I've gotten 20 or 30. I'm about ready to take my resume." This goes to another question here. I'm about ready to take it off Indeed. I can't take it anymore. I don't want, I just can't. I've got enough. And I said, and then my question would be, well, why did you call me back?
Mhm.
And she said, "I could tell from the message that you left that you knew what you were doing."
Mhm.
And so the recruiter will um, establish a rapport. And if the nurse doesn't feel like they're connecting, there are 20, 30 others waiting, and just find 2 or 3 that you do feel that you've connected with. And there are really some really good recruiters out there.
Are there any instances where they would go directly to the hospital and not talk to a recruiter, or do they all go through?
Well, they would go directly to the hospital for perm jobs, of course. New grads, they go directly to the hospital because they don't qualify. They don't have the 2 years experience. This kind of is in the same vein. Sometimes when they're traveling on assignment, the hospital approaches them and asks them to come aboard and let's get rid of the agency. That happens.
Uh-huh.
That happens to us a lot.
I think, yeah. Uh-huh.
Yes, and a lot of hospitals use the travel device to recruit. Instead of paying a recruiter whatever that salary is, an internal recruiter, they'll just use travelers and then try to lure them to perm jobs. But the thing is once it happens, and some agencies charge for that. I don't, but some agencies do charge the facility to pay them extra monies for that nurse. Um, but the thing is I hear all the time, the nurses tell me, they'll say, "Oh, they're trying to get me to come perm. They're trying to go behind your back." And because, and then they say, "I'm not going to do it. I don't want to." The
Yeah,
reason I left,
not
I'm
to do
making
that.
more
Yeah.
money, and I don't want the politics.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so it's really in vain most of the time, if that answered your question.
No, it does. One of my first jobs was with Kelly Services, used to be called Kelly Girl, and it was the kind of
Yeah.
thing you went to work and they hired you. That company would owe Kelly a fee if they tried to hire you. So I remember it's always kind of worked that way. But I think, like you said, if you're wanting to be a travel nurse, that's not usually going to work. And if somebody's listening to this and they're thinking of becoming a travel nurse, what would you recommend to them? I mean, what would make them make the decision, and how can they make it be as lucrative and satisfying?
They could. There are enormous amounts of sites, travel nurse sites, that they can just Google any, and they have changed over the years. But there are travel nurse sites that are for travel nurses only. That it's very easy for them to get on. It's free, and it's just a tremendous networking support resource. They can ask them, "Hey, well, who are your favorite recruiters? What are the great hospitals? What agencies should I stay away from?" The networking, and that's another selling point I give to my new travelers who are tentative about getting into the travel agency. You're going to have the most support that you've ever had. The travel nurses all support each other. They ultimately know each other, even if they live across the country, because they stick together. They will inform the nurse what to do, exactly what to ask, who are their favorite recruiters, agencies, again, hospitals or specific units in hospitals to stay away from. So they have all kinds of support. And then once they're in, the camaraderie amongst the travelers is unbelievable. They support each other. And that's another reason why the nurses start. They make strong bonds, and then they start traveling with their buddies, and they refer their buddies. It's a big referral kind of business.
I imagine. Well, we covered a lot, and I want to make sure I ask you everything you want to tell everybody today. So is there anything I didn't ask you that you'd like to touch on in our last minutes here?
I think that a lot of nurses get bad tastes or get confused, and especially from agencies that just sprung up during COVID, that who hired inexperienced recruiters. And those types of situations happened a lot because there was a lot of money to be made. So I would say find, I know the money is important, but to really connect with a recruiter and establish a business relationship where you feel that there is a trust and that you're not going to get any surprises, and that your money is not going to be messed with. And how do you know that? You can do research. You can look on the nursing support group websites. And a lot of it's just the gut feeling. When the nurses that I talk to will say, Lesley, I just feel I can trust you. And it's just because I have been doing this for so long that I'm familiar. They say, I worked at this hospital. I'll say, oh my God, you survived that. And so they know that I've been through the ringer, and I would never want to put, like, let's say a nurse that's not qualified into a situation let's say in a high acuity situation that they would be absolutely not a fit for. So those would be my last words of advice. Find a really old recruiter.
There's an advantage to experience, obviously, and that, in this time when people are working in a hybrid or virtual setting, the age of people is not the factor it used to be. And I've noticed that, and especially in my industry in education. I've worked with people that are close to 80 years old, and we've got plenty of decades left until we get there. So we're good.
Plenty on my side. Well, since I'm so much younger than you are, I do feel for you.
Well, on that happy note, we are going to say thank you so much for being on the show.
No, thank you, Diane. I really appreciate it. And you've been nothing but a great resource for me. Appreciate it.
Oh, well, this was a lot of fun, and I hope everybody takes some time to check out your site. You want to name your site so we can do a little link to it?
A little promo.
A little promo.
It's Code Green Travel Nurses.
Code Green Travelers, isn't it?
Travelers. Yes, thank you.
I got it right. I know you just changed it, so I want to make sure.
Yeah, we changed it a couple times. Code Green Travelers, plural. That's correct.
Yeah, because the older site, I believe, is now Code Green Travelers. And I want to make sure that my people transcribe that properly so that you get everybody to it.
Right. And I checked with a lot of my nurses about Code Green because I was afraid it had hidden kind of slang meanings within different units and hospitals. And I didn't want to say something that was counterproductive. What I was thinking with Code Green is money. And that's typically what the nurses are looking for, the highest paid position. But again, all the factors that I mentioned do weigh heavily into it as well.
I thought I saw it also meant they need extra help. Code Green.
It does. One of the definitions does say needing extra help. So that's where Code Green would come in as well.
Well, that's awesome. And I hope everybody takes some time to check out your site. And this is a wrap for another episode of Take the Lead Radio.